Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome on this glorious sunny day to our one of James Cooper Kreston Academies webinars. We're here in Reading at the moment, on the very topical subject of general annual grant pooling, or GAG pooling as we'll call it for the rest of the webinar. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm Head of Charities and Education at James Cooper Kreston, and I'm joined by Alex Peel, who's head of our audit team. Both of us work with many academies. So we've got a good mix of people on the call. Not surprisingly, most of them, I think, from multi-academy trusts. Most, I think, as we'll find out, probably not using GAG pooling at the moment. But hopefully you'll get some useful information over the next half an hour or so. In front of you on your screens, hopefully you've got the slides, which will lead you through the presentation. You should also have a facility to ask questions online, and we'll endeavour to come back to your questions at the end of the webinar. The webinar is also recorded and will, soon after it's held, will be available on our website. So for those of you who enjoy it so much, you're very welcome to watch it for a second time. But perhaps more usefully, if you have any colleagues who you think might be interested in watching it, you can refer them to it. Okay, so in terms of the structure of the webinar, we'll start with some background in terms of what GAG pooling is and why it's relevant at the moment. We'll give some feedback from our Kreston Academies Benchmark report 2019, based on around 350 academies. There was an interesting section in there on GAG pooling. We'll talk about why culture change is really important in this GAG pooling considerations. We'll link GAG pooling into MAT growth, multi-academy trust growth. We'll look at how you achieve GAG pooling and the step process that you might implement to get there. And finally, we will look at what the positives and the negatives are. And those of you that have perhaps whizzed through your pack will see that there are actually two slides on the positives and one on the negatives, but we'll let you draw your own conclusions as to whether you think it's a good thing or not. Right, so we'll start with the background. So in essence, in GAG pooling, the trust will receive funding centrally and then will allocate budgets to individual schools, rather than in the main, the present arrangements where schools receive the income and then perhaps pay a top slice back to centre. More of that a bit later. It's fair to say that GAG pooling hasn't been used a great deal to date. It has actually been available, however, since 2013, but financial pressures and other considerations, as you'll see, will make it more relevant at the moment. There's two very short paragraphs in the Academy's Financial Handbook on managing general annual grant. The 2019 handbook came out only last week, and the wording is unchanged from the previous year. So it allows the freedom to amalgamate a proportion of GAG into a central fund. The MAT does need to consider the needs and allocation of each constituent academy, and there is an appeals process where you can appeal to the ESFA if an individual school feels aggrieved in some way. Important to mention that in the multi-academy trust context, a duty of care is owed to all pupils in all the schools in the multi-academy trust. And interesting to note that Lord Agnew is very much in favour of GAG pooling. So in 2018, for example, he wrote to auditors saying he thought this was a good answer to some of the issues in academy schools. He said it was one of the greatest freedoms that a multi-academy trust has. And he also suggested that it was perhaps a good way of getting funding and achieving improvement in some of the weaker schools. So if we move on to the Kreston Academies Benchmark report, so the trend on the report was for larger and more centralised MATs. So I think we saw in that survey the average number of schools in the MATs had increased from 3.5 to 5.6 over a 2-year period, and 20% of the MATs in the survey expected to add 5 or more schools to their trust in the next 12 months. But I think some multi-academy trusts are finding it rather hard to attract schools if all the budgetary control is removed, as might be perceived to be the case in the GAG pooling situation. So in the survey, which which was carried out based upon the 2018 results, there are 350 academies in the survey, but only 3 of them were actually using GAG pooling. But that was a 200% increase on the previous year, where there was only 1 academy using GAG pooling. So clearly, if that rate of increase is maintained in 10 years' time, everyone will be using it. So in terms of the reasons for not GAG pooling, we did a survey. Within that survey in relation to that, 50% said it was due to internal political challenges, and only 5% were planning or seriously considering it. But it's perhaps worth mentioning this is based on 2018 data, and I think it has become much more a point for discussion and much more topical, even just within the last 6 months. I think it's fair to say that if it's going to happen much more widely, it needs encouragement from the DFE and the regional schools commissioners, making sure that they address what the benefits might be and indeed answer any concerns. And in that, within that, I think we're seeing that the RSCs are much more involved in rebrokering schools into different multi-academy trusts. So there were 250 of those in 17-18. So that's the broad background. Now I think we're going to launch a poll now, so a bit of audience participation. So the question is, GAG pooling, are you A, doing it now? I think we may know the answer to that question. B, actively considering it. C, interested but at an early stage. And the final option, very unlikely to implement it. So we'll give you a few moments just to come up with your thoughts on that. Just a few moments longer. So interesting, we do have some people on the call who are doing GAG pooling at the moment. Relatively small number actively considering it. And perhaps not surprisingly, 43% are interested but at an early stage. So clearly there is some interest, and around 30% are saying that they're very likely to implement it. So I think perhaps those are probably the numbers that we might have anticipated. It's interesting to see that people on the call actually doing it. So if we move on to another aspect of the benchmarking report, so this is a slight detour, but is relevant, the question of central service charges. So this is the reason I think why some schools don't join MATs, because they don't like the idea of the central service charge. In terms of how these charges are calculated in the survey, 59% doing it as a percentage of income basis, 20% were doing it on a per pupil basis, and various other methods were being used as well, such as a flat charge per school or a time-based charge. I think it's very much the case for MATs who are making central charges to communicate clearly the services that they're providing and the benefits that they give. Within that context, we did see within the survey that there was some evidence of increasing efficiency within multi-academy trusts, which perhaps hadn't been quite so evident in previous surveys. And then in terms of the bulk of the central service charges, which are based upon a percentage of income, the trend was generally towards a 4 or 5% charge, although interestingly, approximately 5% of multi-academy trusts are levying a central charge of 9% or more. It's quite apparent, I think, with GAG pooling that culture change is really important. It's a shift from considering my school to all children across the mat. So there may well be local interests that make this something of a challenge. As indeed all things relating to schools, the heads of school are like key and they need to be on board in terms of this process. I think the suggestion is that part of a head's appraisal process should include how they're working together as part of a group within a multi-academy trust context. It's sensible to include them in the budget setting process. I think if people are more involved in something, they're more likely to work with it. There'll be the importance of agreeing central MAT policies, and important to have a close MAT leadership team with the same aspirations. If you've got somebody in that team who's really just focused on perhaps their school only, then GAG pooling is going to be quite difficult to implement. So what can GAG pooling do? Well, we've listed on the next slide some of the things that it can do, and I'm sure you may have your own views on this. The first two, redistributing funds from richer to poorer schools and smoothing out funding disparities within a MAT, and clearly there's a link here, the national funding formula. It enables you to direct funds to schools which need to raise educational standards or to schools that require investment in facilities. It also means that you get away from situations of reporting externally deficits within individual schools, and it may well facilitate other MAT policies if there are particular policies that individual MATs want to choose. I think there's a perception that there will always be winners and losers in these situations, but I suppose one needs to envisage a scenario where the MAT develops very successfully and benefits are provided to all, whether that's through improved education, increased income, perhaps efficiency savings, and that the individual schools are able to use the methodologies that the MAT develops so that everyone works together and is successful, and therefore we're not in a scenario where there are winners and losers. In terms of how this links with expanding your MAT, I think we've grouped here two particular scenarios. If you were perhaps a failing school and you need a MAT to take you on, this is very much a distressed transaction. You wouldn't be in a weak bargaining position and would perhaps be likely to accept whatever conditions are imposed. And not surprisingly, in this scenario, GAG pooling is likely to be much easier to implement. For more successful schools, which perhaps can choose to join a MAT or not, or possibly choose which MAT to join, there may be that they will want to have a bit more control over budgets, possibly a seat on the MAT board, etc. So it may be slightly trickier to implement, and perhaps more of a negotiation. It needs to be clear what the strategy that the MAT is in terms of the different schools, etc. And of course, the introduction of GAG pooling, one thing it does do is get rid of any issues around central service charges. Well, naturally, of course, it does bring, as we'll find out later in the webinar, some other issues. I'm now going to hand over to Alex, who's going to talk us about how to achieve GAG pooling benefits and pluses and minuses, etc. Alex.
Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, so just moving on to how to achieve GAG pooling. Obviously, if you've been talking about it and thinking about it, you'll need to decide what to do as a trust. The first thing to really come up with will be a pooling agreement and a policy for what's going to happen, and that will obviously need the agreement of all the existing academies within the multi-academy trust. And there are a number of key issues that you need to think about and include in this agreement, and some of those are listed on the screen at the moment. So, for example, one of the key things will be looking at which funds are going to be pooled, and we'll come on in a minute to more detail about that, which funds can be pooled and which can't. But actually, obviously, deciding what to pool is a key thing. The next thing is to consider whether brought forward reserves are going to be pooled or not. I mean, some multi-academy trusts have a wide variety of schools in them. Some of them, through fortune of history, have significant reserves. Some don't have that, and it could be quite a decisive thing to perhaps take reserves from a school that historically has had a lot of reserves, whereas other schools might not be so concerned about that. So that can be a key issue. Obviously, criteria for allocation of funds between the different schools will be key, as this will be sort of the thing that drives the allocation of funding going forward. The financial handbook says that a GAG pooling agreement needs to have a clear appeals policy in it, so that if schools don't agree with what's done, then they can work out what to do. And normally that process will be that first they appeal to the trust, and if they can't resolve things amicably, then the ultimate is to appeal to the ESFA, and the ESFA can then disapply pooling provisions if they decide that's the right thing to do. Another area to think about is what reserves will be taken if a school leaves the MAT, and again there are a number of things that could be done. Often what we've seen in the past is that a school leaving might get a fixed sum, so a fixed amount of money they would take as their reserves when they leave. And finally, the scheme of delegation needs to be reviewed to make sure it matches the new procedures. So I mentioned the funding that can be pooled, and essentially this is fairly flexible. Typically, all GAG receipts are applied to a central pot for then sharing out between the different schools. Schools need to consider, or MATs need to consider, the devolved capital formula and other capital money. And sometimes the devolved capital can be a good starting place. Often MATs might think about pooling the capital money before they actually pool the GAG receipts. One thing which is clear is that PFI funding can't be pooled, and so you can't use that money. Pupil premium and other special funding can in circumstances be pooled, and the conditions of funding allow it to be given to benefit pupils at all multi-academy trust schools. Clearly those monies have to be reported on by schools and MATs in terms of what they've done with them. But for example, if you had a MAT policy and you wanted to implement that policy on a MAT-wide basis, then it might be sensible to pool pupil premium monies. For local authority funding, that's down to each local authority to confirm if they're happy for the funds to be pooled, so there's no easy answer on that one. And in terms of local authority SEN funds, they're ring-fenced to be only spent on specific SEN costs. So, as I said, there is quite a lot of flexibility. The actual rules set down in the financial handbook are fairly vague, and there's not a lot of guidance about it other than that PFI money can't be pooled. So there are a lot of things to think about. So in terms of actually how to do it, once you've got the agreement of the various schools, there are a number of steps to consider. Firstly, we need the MAT will need to centralise the money in one bank account, just to engender the culture that it is one set of funding for all of the pupils within the multi-academy trust rather than all of the schools receiving their own money. Budgeting process needs to be considered on both a MAT-wide basis, but obviously still looking at individual school budgets and looking at the individual needs of those schools in the budgeting process. In terms of the mechanics of centralisation, delegation and monitoring, MATs will need to consider how that's done. Often a MAT who is looking at GAG pooling will have a centralised accounts team already, and it's key to sort of agree rules for how that's going to work and what gets delegated to individual schools, individual governing bodies in terms of monitoring the budgeting process. Once all of that's done, then obviously you will pool the income in a group in accordance with the agreement and the policy that you have, and possibly as an end process you might then choose to pool GAG reserves, and that's something that some schools don't do, but might do in due course. And of course, as part of all this, a key message is focusing on the one trust vision all of the time, so that getting away from however many individual schools to one multi-academy trust which is being funded and is looking after the education of all of the children within the trust. So what are the positives and negatives? In terms of the positives, I think, as Mike mentioned, we've got 2 slides worth of these. Firstly, a consistent approach across the multi-academy trust. Trust policies can be applied much more consistently if funding is all going into the centre rather than going into individual schools. And that sort of leads on to the next point, really, the freedom to make decisions for the MAT as a whole, as opposed to individual schools making decisions or being constrained by individual schools having various budgetary constraints. Improved access to leadership team for all schools. Again, where GAG money is pooled, often the multi-academy trust will have a centralised team, so perhaps an education team to look at the improvement in all of the MAT schools. And funding centrally allows that to happen more consistently across the whole of the trust. A number of other efficiency gains, such as having centralised suppliers, buying IT equipment, for example, centrally could save significant amounts of money for a decent sized multi-academy trust, rather than all of the individual schools doing it by themselves, so sort of buying in bulk. One budgeting process, again, doing the budgeting process centrally, albeit sort of still breaking down the individual schools, will potentially be more efficient than doing the budgeting process in however many different schools there are and then amalgamating them. If you have one bank account, typically it will be a lot easier to manage that bank account than having lots of different bank accounts related to all of the different schools. And something that's particularly topical at the moment is fraud, and having one bank account and a centralised team are often efficient measures to reduce the impact or the potential risk of fraud. And as Mike mentioned earlier, there's no requirement to disclose schools in deficit, and if you GAG pool, then you don't have to then split out all of the individual school reserves. More positives, smoothing funding disparities. So, for example, if you have a school whose numbers are growing rapidly, often their funding can be a year or so behind, or the increase in funding can be a year or so behind. And you might have another school in the trust whose numbers are more consistent or actually falling, and that can then be smoothed across the trust, rather than the school with rapidly growing numbers is being disadvantaged and the school with falling numbers looking like it's in a good position, and that actually not being the case. I've mentioned earlier, or Mike mentioned earlier, the ability to push funds around where standards or perhaps facilities need improving. Often a MAT with a number of schools within the multi-academy trust will have ongoing projects over a number of years, and sometimes it can be one school's turn for their facilities to be improved, and then in another year it might be the turn of another school. The traditional way of funding schools means that actually it's hard to look at that on a year-by-year basis, but if you can take a view over a number of years, and doing that with the pooling of funds, that can make it a lot easier. If you put all the money into one pot in the first place, that can reduce disputes over top slicing and reduce the perception that money is being paid into the centre where schools aren't really sure what it's being used for. As we mentioned, improved financial governance can be an advantage for a number of reasons. Better allocation of resources and forward thinking. Again, some of the things we've mentioned allows the MAT to be far more strategic in terms of looking at where those resources need to go, not being constrained by individual schools having surpluses and deficits in particular years. Aligning budgets to curriculum planning, again, a key area. If a school needs to work on a particular thing, perhaps if they've had a poor Ofsted visit, then funds can be directed to that particular focus. And again, you can do that outside the process of individual schools having surpluses and deficits. A clear focus on the MAT vision and the ability to support schools in times of need, again, very important areas. I think we've sort of mentioned some of the times where schools might need support, but often if, for example, a school had a particular issue in terms of an Ofsted report, numbers rapidly growing because of perhaps housing development, and a number of other areas, it allows the MAT to focus in on that school and then allocate monies which might not be possible normally. So lots of positives, negatives of GAG pooling, and perhaps the reason why this slide is shorter is, whilst there are a lot of positives, perhaps the negatives are more striking and more difficult to overcome. Transition and change issues and unhappy leaders, parents, they're both key areas. This perception that there's one multi-academy trust can actually be very difficult for both teachers and leaders in schools and parents with children in those individual schools to accept. And the view that, well, we're being funded for 300 pupils, therefore we should have all of that funding, is very prevalent, and parents particularly can get very excited where they believe that their school is not being treated fairly by the multi-academy trust, even though they may then get the funding in future years. That sort of also covers internal political challenges within local governing bodies. Often when schools join MATs, there is the sense that they're being taken over or controls being taken away from those local governing bodies, and where there's a suggestion that funding may be taken away from them as well, that can cause significant challenges. If reserves are pooled and reserves are taken away from schools, that's just going to lead to the same thing. And because of all of these things, schools might be reluctant to join multi-academy trusts. And of course, once schools are in there, if schools want to leave as well, that can also cause issues, particularly if the agreement is that they take reserves away with them. So perhaps they're then taking reserves at a time when the MAT as a whole doesn't really have very much to start off with. So there are some significant potential difficulties. And again, time for a bit of audience participation. We've got another poll just to look at some of those. So I think a couple of people had already said that they are GAG pooling, and some people are thinking about it. This poll is, what's stopping you from doing it? There are a lot of potential advantages, as we've seen, but lots of people aren't doing it. So what are the reasons? Internal politics, current financial position. So perhaps actually all of the schools are in deficit at the moment, so there isn't a good reason for doing it. Too difficult, or some other reasons. So I'll just give you a few seconds to fill that in. And I think unsurprisingly, given the last slide, internal politics is by far the most consistent reason. Sort of 71% of people are saying that internal politics is the thing that's stopping it happening. So I'll just now pass back over to Mike, who's going to finish the presentation, and then we will take questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. So very interesting to see that internal politics was a big issue for many of you. So we'll wait to see how that develops. So in terms of issues, we've covered a number of them. Some people will see this as a further step in the commercialisation of education and will not find it very attractive. We've seen that culture change is important. We've seen the need for good communication with some of the complex issues that arrive. There will inevitably, in some situations, be a perceived loss of control, and the question of trust of the central office, etc., will be important. We've seen the potential for unhappiness during transition, although one could argue that any transition in any organisation, will usually make some people unhappy. We've seen the potential efficiencies that this might give. I mean, it's perhaps worth making a comparison with the independent school sector. I mean, clearly one of the benefits the independent schools have is the far more substantial levels of funding that are available, with average school fees being around 15,000 compared to perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 funding plus facilities that an academy will receive. But many independent schools now comprise groups of schools rather than one individual school, and they have been doing this for years. Naturally, much of this links with the funding issues, and anything that can be done to improve funding is important. Whilst Alex was speaking, on the basis of the 200% increase that I referred to earlier on, I worked out that it would be just over 4 years, based upon that 2% increase carrying on at that rate, that perhaps in 4 years everyone will be doing GAG pooling, but we'll wait to see. So that concludes the formal part of the webinar. We have had some questions that have come through. A couple of questions. Do we still need to monitor financial results at individual schools? Alex, did you want to take that one?
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yes, so the question is, do we still need to monitor results at individual schools? The answer to that is yes, you do. So despite the fact that the money would go into a central pot, you would still budget for those individual schools, and then you would still monitor actual results against those budgets. So the answer is yes, you will.
Thank you, Alex. And the other question we've had is, why is it so topical just at the moment? I suppose really more people are becoming aware of it, looking at efficiencies. That clearly there are financial pressures. multi-academy trusts are getting bigger and there are issues with central charges. So as a result of all these and no doubt many other factors, it is much more topical at the moment. So on that final slide, we've listed a few additional resources. There is a GAG Pooling help sheet on our website. We've also referenced the Kreston Academies Benchmark report. We ran a webinar on that earlier in the year, so if you want to watch that and didn't see it first time around, you're very welcome to do it. And we've also linked a link to the new Academies Financial Handbook. So we've got various other webinars coming up over the next period of time, so we'll be doing something shortly in terms of the accounts direction in the Academies Financial Handbook, so you'll be receiving an invite to those. Oh, we've had a couple of late entrants on the questions before we close. So, someone said, I can understand how this might work on a case-by-case basis. I think that's very true and perhaps isn't going to work in every scenario. And another question, what would be a fair way of allocating a GAG on a more routine basis? A tricky one to answer that. I think, it'd be a question of looking at the specifics. All multi-academy trusts are constituted in a different way. I think what will be important is making sure that there's a consistent and what is perceived to be a fair way of allocating general annual grants so that everyone feels it's been done in a reasonable way without prejudicing the interests of any individual school. So thanks very much for joining us. You'll see our contact details on that page. If you've got any further questions, Alex and I would welcome a call or an email. So finally, thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.